Yes, thank you very much. I've already mentioned in the main room, I've just mentioned briefly again that these are findings from a large piece of work that was undertaken for DEFRA, and I should do what I didn't do in there, which is name check my colleagues on the work, who were Lee Morris and Lindsay Wright from Bonamy Finch, and Annabelle Butler and Kate Miscally from Big Island. It was a big piece of work. If you had a chance, I think you all have a summary, 6-page summary in your Communicate bags if you want to look at them at some point. You could read them instead of listening to me if you like, it might be more interesting. The report itself is it was a huge piece of work. The report itself runs to 100 and something pages, and then there's a technical annex. It was confusing, and I got quite confused myself. So when I try and think about what the overall story of the research is, I go back to the title that we gave it in the end, which was Engaging People in Biodiversity Issues. I'll make one note just for clarification. I've made it before that it is about engaging people in biodiversity issues, so not about the broader concerns of engaging people in nature, which is a much broader set of questions. And I think two questions that follow immediately from that title. First is, what on earth do you mean by engagement? And that's the way that we try to tackle that question I've already talked about in my short speech earlier in terms of this work we did on the tiering study. And the second question, which is the one I want to focus on now, is engagement in what? When we talk about biodiversity issues, when I came to Communicate a year ago and was sort of starting to talk to people about this, the one bit of consensus one of the bits of consensus I detected was that biodiversity is probably not the most useful word to be using here, and not just the word, that the concept itself is quite a tricky one. And I actually think there are some quite significant problems with this concept of biodiversity as a starting point for engagement activity. And as I mentioned in the big room previously, I mean, one response to that is to say, well, we have to educate people about biodiversity. We have to tell them what it is and why it matters as the first step to engagement. Maybe that is a good approach, but my own view is that that's trying to change people so that they fit our concept. And the suggestion I have is maybe we need to think about changing the way that we talk about these issues so that it fits better with people. And that's what we mean by the idea of reframing biodiversity. So engagement in what? And I'm going to take my talk in two big chunks in terms of presenting the findings. I want to talk a little bit about our findings and what our understanding of what is the problem with this concept of biodiversity. Why is it not really working very well as a basis for engagement? And then I want to move on, that's the negative part of the talk, if you will, and then I want to move on to the positive part, which is to understand something about what that might mean for reframing biodiversity. And let me say up front that I am a researcher and not a communications expert. I shall endeavour to present. I'm going to present what I think of as being practical recommendations and thoughts, but researchers are notoriously impractical, so there's going to be a gap for you to fill in. I'm the warm-up act for the talking that you're going to be doing afterwards. Before we do any of that, I want to do just a little quick reflective exercise, and really the purpose of this is just to remind ourselves a little bit about what a strange concept this thing biodiversity is in the first place, because I think it's quite easy to forget it. So a little exercise. I'd like you to reflect just for a second. I'd like to think about the last time that you went out into a natural setting in a professional context, whatever it is that you do. So in a professional context, you're out in a natural setting. What were you doing? What were you up to? And therefore, what were you paying attention to in the environment around you? What were you looking out for actively, or what were you noticing? What sorts of things were you seeing? What were you not noticing? And then, continuing that exercise, you might like to compare that to putting yourself in the shoes of these people, all of whom we can imagine are taking a walk through a woodland or through whatever environment it was you were in when you last went out. So lots of different sorts of people there that we can imagine taking a walk through the wood. What are they all doing? What are they all paying attention to? What are they noticing? The point I'm trying to make here is not a complicated one, but I do think it's worth making all the same, and it's that whenever we have any experience in life, there are at this moment, around us now, there are things that I'm paying attention to. I'm paying a lot of attention to everybody's faces to try and get any kind of feedback out of it that I can. But I'm frankly paying no attention to all the things that are moving out there. I'm not really paying any attention. I've just noticed there are two people sitting over there and I hadn't even noticed them yet. Those are in the background. We have this idea of foreground and background. That's true of any experience that we have. And of course it's true if you're out going for that walk through the woodland. There are going to be things that are in the foreground and things that are going to be in the background. When we talk about biodiversity, we are talking about living things, obviously a wide range of living things. And in the same way, in our experiences of nature, those living things may be more in the foreground or more in the background. Some may be in the foreground, some may be in the background. If I'm a bird watcher, I'm going to see birds, I'm really be looking out for birds, pay very little attention to trees, probably. Well, it depends what role they're playing. If I'm looking for a bird that lives in a particular kind of tree, yeah, it changes, yeah, you get the point. So when we looked at the kinds of experience that people in our workshops that we ran were describing, that's the evidence on which it's still based. We didn't actually have many of these, I made this one up. Over at this end, we can imagine a conservationist who's going out maybe monitoring biodiversity. And guess what? Living things, perhaps very specific types of living things, are going to be very much in the foreground of their experience. They're actively discriminating, looking for, trying to find those things. At the other end, we can imagine the proverbial dog walker. As someone pointed out to me earlier, on the current measures we have of engagement with biodiversity, the best measure we could, the best thing we could do is give everyone a dog, because they'd all have to walk it, and the engagement goes sky high. But it just shows how important the case is. But there's our dog walker, probably out for a walk, having a really nice time, and the living things are sort of wallpaper. Absolutely part of the experience, and certainly I'm consciously monitoring, because if a fox does something interesting and runs across the path, I will notice it and pay attention, but not really a big part of my experience. And in the middle, we can imagine an experience here described to us by some of our participants, and quite an important way for many of us engaging with nature, which we can call, to put some words on it, receptively attentive. It's that situation where you're not necessarily looking for anything specific, but you, as one participant put it, you open yourself up to see what you see. So you're sitting there and you broaden your awareness out. And I had some other people there, didn't I? And we could try and map those onto the same scale. And in some cases, I've no idea where to put them. I mean, a photographer, for instance, but it depends what they're taking photographs of, doesn't it? So depending on what we're up to, we experience, make sense of nature slightly different, in very different ways. Now, these are not types of people, very obviously. This could be the same person on 6 different days of the week. So I'm not making a point about types of people. But my observation to you would be that the people that we met in our workshops, who are members of that mysterious entity, the general public, to which of course we also belong, but for the purposes of today they're everyone not in the room. The people we met in our workshops, like me, I have to be honest with you, spend most of our time in nature doing this, and then we have some excursions, some very nice excursions into this middle ground. Don't really do the thing over on the right there, particularly. If you have a particular hobby, if you are, I had one young man I was talking to who really lived in the country, just kind of trying to talk about living things, couldn't talk about it, and then suddenly started talking about corvids, which I thought was quite a surprising, sudden kind of real active discrimination going on there, because he has a bit of work that involves going around shooting them. So there we are, he's having an experience of actively discriminating, but most people didn't. I'm guessing that given the roles that you have, that many of you will spend some of your time over there. So you have if that's the case, you have a slightly different experience of living things in nature than many of the people that you'll be trying to communicate to. And that has an impact on what concepts make sense to you at an experiential and emotional level. Let's go back to biodiversity, which is what this is all about. Everybody knows that there's a huge variety of living things out there in nature. We all know that. But that's not what biodiversity is saying. Biodiversity is not a fancy way of saying that there are lots of huge variety of living things in nature. It's not a statement of a fact. Biodiversity is this attempt to talk about how much variety there is in nature. It takes this fact that we all know about it and turns it into this sort of strange semi-scientific thing, something like a variable that can go up and down. And that's a really, really strange thing to people like me. We spend our time over here. I did this project for many months and I still actually at some level can't quite get my head around this. Of course I can intellectually, I'm not saying people are stupid, but it doesn't really fit with my experience. Now, Of course, if you spend a lot of your time over here, that concept may come much more readily to you. And of course, the scientists who dreamt it up, who do spend a lot of time over there, no criticism of them. It comes easily to them because it's part of their experience. So just remember that. Biodiversity is not a fancy way of saying something we all know. It's not a fancy way of saying that there is variety in nature. It's much more strange and weird than that. And I'm afraid that's where our problems begin. It's not the whole problem by any means, it's just where they start. Have a look at this quotation, which is from somebody in our workshops, and it captures a very common theme, really. I don't believe that we can reduce the variation in nature, because everything we've learnt about nature, be it at school or elsewhere, is telling us nature is all about diversity and variation and DNA changing. So I just don't believe we can stop the variation, or we can't change nature. In that quotation, you see two things. First of all, I think you can see that tension between the fact and the variable. Fact, no problem, yeah, get that completely. But this variable thing going down, but it's not just that they're saying it's strange. When they intellectually start to wrestle with it, they're also saying, I don't believe you. I don't see how this thing can go down, which is quite strange. So what's going on here? Let me come at this little peculiarity in another way. Let me come at it not from the point of view of variety, because maybe it's that strange concept. Let me come at it from the point of view of something that does make a lot more intuitive sense to many people, certainly the people in our workshops, which is this idea that there is interdependence in nature. So many people mapped out this way of thinking about interdependence in nature, and they used words like food chains and webs and other things that they picked up along the way. They get the idea that different living things have different roles to play. They got the idea that those roles are all interconnected and that there's a balance between the bits of the system. So they completely got the idea that removing or damaging part of the system is likely to have knock-on effects. So we thought, well, maybe this is another way in to this concept. Okay, it's not quite biodiversity, but maybe this is a good way in. Except when you start talking about removing links in the chain, when you start prompting people on that, you get responses like this. Well, nature adapts. If a link in the chain is broken, nature is very good at creating another link around it. So again, it's almost as if when you present the issue, people are saying, yeah, but it isn't really an issue, is it? Because nature gets around it. What's going on here? Well, this is where we get to the issue of stories. And what I want to suggest to you, I think I mentioned it before, is that there are some big stories out there that people are already telling about nature, about our relationship with nature, and about ourselves, in fact. And that those provide a backdrop against which people make sense of the things that are being said to them. And the first of those stories that I want to talk about is precisely what I just referred to. It's this one, we called it Nature Finds a Way. And it was a very common story in our workshops. And I think that little image of the little leaf pushing through the cracks in some ways says it far more eloquently than any words, but I'll give you some words anyway. These are the elements of this story. These are my words, I'm afraid, but if you go back to the report, you'll find lots and lots of the quotations that have it in people's own words, which probably express much better than mine. So at the heart of this story is this idea of natural systems, of nature as a process, its remarkable capacity to regenerate and recover and adapt. As a result, nature itself, people see it as this sort of dynamic equilibrium. What I mean by that is that balance is not, this natural balance is not some kind of precarious state. It's an active verb. It's the thing that nature does. And when you damage that system, well, it's not permanent, because nature will recover. That's what nature does. It recovers and adapts. Maybe after very serious damage, the equilibrium may be in a very different place, but it will recover. And as a result, people will tell you that no species is irreplaceable. In fact, they're quick to point out that species loss is a natural process. And here's another quote to those lines. Like when that world had the big thing that happened that reduced species by 70%, they all came back eventually. No problem. Yeah? Now, some of you might be thinking at this point that we recruited a remarkably complacent bunch of people to our groups, and we didn't, because this is only one of the stories. And the really important thing is that this story lives alongside a second story I want to talk about. And it lives alongside, not just in our culture, but in our heads as well. So it's bunkering together in people's heads. So the same people will be saying these things as are saying some of the other things that we're talking about. The second story about nature in our workshops, the second big story that we identified, was nature can't keep up. The first was nature finds a way. Second, nature can't keep up. Let me give you the key elements of this story. Again, this is a story that our participants were telling. It's the thing that's already out there. It starts from the observation that humans necessarily have an impact on nature. Quite important. No one was saying that they thought that natural places were places we hadn't interfered with. When we talked about that, they said, well, if that's what natural places are, then there aren't any left. So, not about nature being, natural places being places where in some cases we've capped out altogether. We necessarily have an impact on nature, as some people put it, we have to eat, was one of the points that was made a number of times. Some of this impact is negative, and some of it's positive. And the ideal, of course, is to strike a balance between our needs and the needs of nature. The reality in this story, recognised by all of those other people we've just been talking about, the reality is we're taking too much, too fast. And nature doesn't have time to recover as a result. Those natural processes are not having time to operate. So this was our second story. Now, superficially, these two stories may look as if they're contradicting each other. But the resolution lies in the time frames on which they operate. So we can say once upon a time, but we've got quite different times that we're talking about here. This one is operating, the Nature Finds a Way story is operating by and large on much larger time frames. So people will talk about this story, which is operating on more human time frames, and they'll contemplate the idea that we're rushing to extinction, and then cheerfully point out that just like the dinosaurs, nature will recover after we've gone. So it's resolved by the different time frames. Here's a participant commenting on that. I'm thinking of it in the now and then in the very long term. So not in 10 or 20 years' time, but now and then beyond me. So quite how we draw those time frames in kind of concrete numbers of years, but there's this sense of different time frames operating. As a result, you can get quite different concepts, quite different ways of thinking about the same concept, depending on which of these frames of mind someone is in. And it was really interesting. We had lots of debates in the workshops. People would debate about some of the issues I'm about to put up. They really enjoyed debating them. And they kind of go around in circles, and then they comment at the end, oh, I've gone around in circles. And sometimes you find the same person arguing one point of view, and then 5 minutes later the other point of view. Let's take the question of whether damage is permanent. Well, it depends. If you're answering from the perspective of the Nature Finds a Way story, then the answer is no, because the system recovers. But if you're answering from the perspective of a much more human time frame, then you're likely to point out that yes, the damage is permanent because species are lost. And that's the debate that people would have within this session. Take another concept, balance. Balance can mean very different things depending on which story you're talking about. In the Nature Finds a Way story, we have the balance of nature. And that's something natural processes take care of. It's what nature does. It's an active verb. We can disturb it, yeah, but nature always finds a new balance. So that's the one where perhaps we don't have to worry about something. On the other side, we have the balance between nature's needs and our needs. And that's absolutely up to us to get right. Participants were very clear about this. And there's clear evidence that we're taking too much too fast. Two big stories. And what our view is, based on our workshops, is that what's happening with the concept of biodiversity is perhaps it's something about the sort of the scientific nature of it, the way it's set up, but it's automatically pushing people into this frame of mind. This is the frame of mind in which they're responding to that concept. So when you start talking about biodiversity, then talking about the fact of the wonderful diversity of nature, they start thinking about these long-term processes. And when you talk about then biodiversity being reduced, they say, no, rubbish. Nature takes care of itself. So it's almost as if the way that the concept is set up, it undermines the threat. It undermines the loss. All well and good. What might it, I'm guessing many of you weren't particularly attached to the concept of biodiversity in the first place, but what does this mean in terms of actually doing something more positive? Well, let me be clear at the outset. The one thing I'm absolutely not going to suggest is that we need to somehow get rid of story A and focus on story B. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is, so far as I'm aware, story A is substantially true, which is a little bit of a problem with getting rid of it. The second is it has enormous, I think, hold, because it's true, I'd like to think, or it's a part of the truth, has enormous hold in our culture to be a very difficult thing to do. And crucially, it also has a vital ingredient in there. In terms of engagement, it has a vital starting point that we need to tap into. When people talk about, at least in our workshops, when people talked about this process of regeneration, of recovery, they did so, I'm going to borrow words from Futura here, they did so with awe and wonder. People got excited about this. They got philosophical, they got spiritual, I would say. My word, not theirs, but it came out and people sort of started to get quite excited and then say, oh, I'm sounding like a hippie, aren't I? But, so people got very, very excited about this. There is a real feeling of excitement and awe and wonder about this process of regeneration and recovery. And that's a great starting point, potentially, for engagement. If we want to talk about biodiversity in a way that will get people excited, maybe that provides a starting point. So, can we tap into awe and wonder at nature's capacity to grow, adapt and recover, that magical quality of nature? The magic that, if you can all remember back to the first time you were a kid and had cress seeds, and put them on the paper, and then they grow. That's the sense of magic that we all kind of hold on to in some way. What happens to biodiversity? What happens to living things in that? Well, maybe we can reposition the living things and the diversity of living things as the products and agents of that process. So maybe the process itself becomes the hero, but all of those amazing living things around are still in there. They're still in there as products and agents of that process, or the people who are playing it out, or the characters playing it out. Sorry. Crucially, however, if we get stuck at that level, we haven't got a risk, we haven't got a threat, we haven't got something to react to. That's what we saw with biodiversity. We don't have the problem. So we have to find some way of invoking both stories about nature at the same time. Yes, bringing in this awe and wonder, but sticking to the human time frames of the nature can't keep up story. I'm not a communicator, as I mentioned, so I won't have very good ideas here, but the sort of thing I'm talking about is a concept like making space for nature, where the making space is about something we do now, but the magic of nature is something that is going on. Or it's about helping nature to help itself. Those kinds of concepts, but I look to others to develop better ones than I can. The third thing, before we leave this, I'd like to mention is just remind you, this nature can't keep up story does not run humans are evil and nature's getting panned. It starts with an observation that we have to have an impact on nature. We have to take things from it, and we're getting the balance wrong. And so it's really important not to position this as just being all about the negative things that humans are doing. And what we found in workshops is if we even teetered on the edge of that, we would prompt reactions of defeatism or defensiveness, neither of which are very helpful from an engagement point of view, or indeed particularly good for the people who are feeling defeatist or defensive. So the suggestion here is we need to focus on that imbalance. And remember, it's not an imbalance in nature, because nature sorts that out. It's the imbalance between the negative and positive impacts that we have. We need to celebrate the positive while talking about that imbalance. So celebrate the positive, but talk about the imbalance. Don't focus exclusively on the negative. So 3 suggestions there. I've just got a few more minutes in which I'd like to talk about 2 other big stories that we identified in the workshops. And these are not stories, I talked about 2 stories about nature here, nature finding a way and nature not being able to keep up. The remaining 2 big stories are 2 big stories about humanity, about us, but they do potentially have a big bearing on how we set up, how we go about framing and talking about biodiversity. The first of these stories are called Humanity Finds a Way. Obviously we all hope that humanity will find a way, so that bit of it's good. But really what this is a story about, it's about humanity finding a way without needing to rely on nature. It's all about the triumph of technology. It's probably the inheritor of some grand enlightenment story, but don't let me wander. It's the Star Trek vision of the future. And it's the idea that, well, maybe this doesn't really matter very much because we'll find a way around it technologically. Or, as one person summed it up rather succinctly, so what if a fish dies out, I'll eat another one. So we know that the response to this is, we kind of know the answer here. It's about it's going back to talk about ecosystem services, about the ways in which we do rely on nature, about the benefits it provides to us. But I want to go a little bit further than that, because I want to just put forward a hypothesis about why we can even have this story in the first place, why it feels like a possible story. And I want you to think about that first story we talked about, Nature Finds a Way, and I want you to think about your day-to-day experiences of living in human spaces, places like cities and buildings and having a garden and all of those sorts of things, those human spaces. And how do we experience natural processes in those spaces? Very often we experience them as things that we're trying to exclude or keep out. They may sweep through and damage it. We know that if we don't look after a part of a city, say an old car park, it'll be overgrown with living things very quickly. We know that if that city is left for a couple of centuries, then it'll be covered by the Amazon rainforest, and people get very excited about telling you about that, because that's that first story. So our experience of human spaces is pretty much on a day-to-day basis, unless you're one of the few people who know better. Our experience is one of spaces which we are creating by pushing out, excluding, ruling out these natural processes. So when you come along to me and tell me, actually, all those human spaces and that human lifestyle that you have is actually dependent on those natural processes, I can nod at you and I can agree with you, and intellectually I can get my head around it. But I'm afraid at another level it makes no sense to me whatsoever. I'll give you the example of water and clean water, because this is one that it's mentioned in a number of it's mentioned in Biodiversity 2020, a number of other places. Yeah, we're dependent on biodiversity for clean water. I have no idea what you're talking about. And nor did the participants in the workshops. I tried it out in one workshop. I asked them where their water, but did you have any idea where the water comes from in your tap? One of them immediately responded, that's really interesting, my daughter asked me that the other day and I didn't know what to say to her. So they had a go as a workshop, as a group, and they got as far as the rain falls, it goes into the reservoir, and then they clean it. And I couldn't improve on that, and I still can't. So what I'm saying here is it comes back to this point about stories. It was a wonderful, wonderful point made earlier about the difference between telling and telling stories. And I think if you look at a lot of what is coming out at the moment around ecosystem services, it's telling us that nature matters, and it's telling us how much nature is worth to us. But it's not showing me, it's not giving me pictures and stories and images about how that actually works. And in the rare cases where we do have those models, those stories, those metaphors, people get it. So the one that did come up in workshops was trees, the Amazon rainforest. Why? The phrase that would reliably follow was, they're the lungs of the earth, aren't they? Now actually, if you think about what lungs do, that's a really, really bad and inaccurate metaphor for what trees do. It makes no sense whatsoever. But that doesn't matter. What it does is it brings the thing that trees are doing into my world, something I can experience. I get the idea of breathing. So it's a very, very effective way of doing it. And we lack that for most of these services. So the plea I have here is show people how nature works for them. Don't just tell them that it matters or how much it's worth. Now it could be about telling them stories about how it works for them, or maybe it's about giving them experiences so they can see it in person. The last story we'll talk about very briefly is a story that isn't about nature at all. It's a story about us. We call it Humanity Can't Keep Up. And I'm not going to say a lot about it because it's a very familiar story, but it came up a lot in our workshops. And it's a story of alienation. It's a story of loss of community. It's a story of feeling somehow that we're out of kilter in the modern world. It's a story that somehow we have a great deal of modern communications technology and yet we don't communicate with each other anymore. Nature features in this story in a very specific way. It features as the place where we can reconnect. It features as a place where we can in some way undo some of this. And that means reconnecting. Nature's a place where we reconnect with nature itself, with something that's bigger than us. Goes back to that first story again. That's what's exciting about that process. It's bigger than us. We reconnect with nature, with each other, across generations, with what really matters, and with ourselves. And I've included it here because it seems to me that, there was some talk earlier about hooking them and then holding them and then revealing, and it feels to me that in practice this is where some of the best hooks are often found, and it seems to be an important part of the mix. In summary, 4 big stories that we found that are out there. Are there others? Maybe. This is truth-seeking, not truth-telling, and maybe among specific communities we'll find different stories, but 4 big stories that seem to be out there. And they're already out there, and they provide the backdrop when we go out and talk about biodiversity. And on this slide, I've summarised the points I've already made as I've gone along about some of the recommendations, about invoking both of those stories about nature. Nature finds a way, and nature can't keep up. But sticking to the time frames of nature can't keep up. Tapping into the awe and wonder that people feel at that amazing natural process of regeneration, growth, adaptation, positioning living things as the products and agents of that. Focusing on the imbalance between the negative, positive impacts of human actions, not exclusively on the negative, and celebrating the positive as well. Showing people how nature works for them, not just telling them that it matters or how much it's worth. And drawing on this idea as nature as a place where one reconnects. I'm going to pass over to you now. I'll just say in passing, it's not my job as a researcher to come in here and completely shock and surprise you. I'm really worried when I shock and surprise people who've been working in the area for many years. I'm hoping there'll be points of contact with things that you already do, and maybe some new thoughts and an opportunity to reflect as well. Let me pass back to Joe.